Okay, now we're back and we're live. We're not really live, but recording. We're going to start in Exodus chapter 20 to look at the Ten Commandments, and this will help us introduce this division of the law between apodictic and casuistic. This will be familiar to you. It's the Ten Commandments. Moses is receiving these on Mount Sinai directly from God, and Exodus chapter 20 opens up with the Ten Commandments, and it says, and God spoke all these words. And so here, you know, the Bible is the Word of God, but how is it the Word of God? Well, it's actually, in some cases in the Old Testament, we have what the Bible gives us as God's direct word, like God said X. Here you have that. These are the words of God, and the Bible, the Old Testament presents these words as coming, God's lips to our ears. The prophets do this too. Isaiah is fond of using the phrase, "Thus saith the Lord," "Thus saith Yahweh," and so he'll have language that, is directly from God. And we talked about this some last week, where the Bible is inspired, and that the way that looks is sometimes different in different texts. Some traditions of Christianity conceive of inspiration exclusively as every single word is literally came from God. But there are human authors obviously involved. After class, Megan and I were talking. The Book of Mormon, for example, in Mormon doctrine, the Book of Mormon literally dropped out of heaven, like not figuratively, but literally. Every word of it came out of heaven, and Joseph Smith simply translated the words. So Joseph Smith is not an author of the Book of Mormon. He's just a translator. But that's different in the Christian tradition. The Jewish and Christian scriptures are acknowledged to be the work of human authors as well as the Word of God. And so that's a crucial distinction to make, that what we have in the Bible is not, in Judeo-Christian tradition, a book that just fell out of the sky. It's a book that human authors played a role in. And so, for example, in Paul, you have Paul speaking in first person, and Paul expressing his personal feelings on things. And you can see and hear, you can read Paul's personality in what he says. He's there in the text. He's not a passive intermediary. It's not like a secretary taking dictation. That's not the way inspiration always works, right? Where the author's sitting there and he hears a voice and he writes down what he hears. But in this case, the Bible is claiming this is Moses taking dictation. Or, for example, when Isaiah says, "Thus saith Yahweh," these are what Isaiah claims that he heard God say. Whereas other parts of the Bible, the human authors have more influence and are writing from their own experiences and understanding under the inspiration of God. So you could put different scriptures in different categories. Sometimes inspiration is direct dictation. Sometimes it's a kind of synergistic movement of the Spirit along with the human author's own thoughts, feelings, and intents. So all is to say here, you have this introduced as directly from God, Moses taking dictation like a secretary. And it says, verse 2, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery." So God identifies himself and defines himself as the God who frees you from slavery. This we usually understand as the first commandment: "You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol in the form of anything in heaven above or on the earth beneath or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not hold anyone guiltless who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy." Oh, here there's actually two different kinds of commands here. There's negative and positive. Lo is the Hebrew word for not or no, and so some commands start with lo, meaning they're negative. Don't do this. And here's a positive command: you will do this. You will keep the Sabbath. by keeping it 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter, nor your manservant or maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within your gates. So this is a law that applies to everyone, whether you're Jewish or not. If you live in the land, you will obey this. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and your mother, so that you may live long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. That's familiar. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not give false testimony against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his manservant or maidservant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, the two commands here that specifically connect to our topic is the verse 14, you shall not commit adultery, but also the last command, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife. Both those commands protect marriage. And so, but these commands, all of the 10 commandments, are apodictic commands. And that simply means they are blanket prescriptions. They say, don't do it or do it, right? And that's in contrast to, let's just move a few pages forward. Flip over to Exodus chapter 22, verse 16. Let's have someone else. Well, you won't be able to hear in our recording if someone else reads, so I'm going to read. Verse 16, if a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. I'm going to read the verse that comes after. Do not allow a sorceress to live. So right here, you have the two different types of Old Testament law. Old Testament law, all of it is divided in two categories, apodictic and casuistic. The first law that we read here is casuistic, and that just means it's phrased conditionally. If this happens, then you must do this, right? It's creating its conditions followed by here's how you are to respond to these conditions. The second law that we read is like the 10 Commandments. It's apodictic. There's no if, then, right? So casuistic, if, then, apodictic, do or don't. It's pretty simple, pretty clear. And so you'll notice then that the first law that covers sexuality or an aspect of sexuality is casuistic. And it says if you seduce a virgin, this is the way the Old Testament deals with premarital sex, right? And it just assumes, in modern times we wouldn't be so sexist, but it just assumes that the man is seducing the woman. The Bible doesn't imagine it happening the other direction, although I think it does. But the Bible sees it. The Bible assumes that the male is initiating the sex. So the next thing to point out is premarital sex forbidden according to this law in the Old Testament? No. Premarital sex is not forbidden. To forbid it would be an apodictic law. It would say, don't have sex before marriage, which is what most churches today teach. I'm not setting First United Presbyterian Church policy here. So I'm just pointing this out, that in the Old Testament, according to the Old Testament law, premarital sex is not forbidden. It just sets the conditions for how you deal with it. Casuistic law doesn't make blanket negations or affirmations. It just says if you have premarital sex and the woman is not engaged or betrothed, then what do you have to do? Pay the bride price and marry her unless the father doesn't consent. Right? So there's no prohibition here on premarital sex. It just says if you do it, you better be prepared to marry the girl. And so, yeah, any questions or comments there? That I often find that surprising to people, that the Old Testament doesn't forbid premarital sex. It just tells you how it's going to be handled. and it's a legal matter. Now what I want to do is, what do your Bibles, just out of curiosity, if you look at chapter 22, what do your Bibles say? How do your Bibles introduce chapter 22? Do you have a heading there? Some Bibles do this, some don't.
Protection of property.
Yeah. That's what mine says too. Protection of property. Now, my Bible, I'm curious how many of yours do this. Do you have a separate heading above verse 16? No. Yeah, I have some yeses and some nos. Right.
Oh yeah, I don't have it on 22, but I do for this verse. That's interesting.
And that, I'm not going to hide my opinions. That's ridiculous nonsense. That's just dumb. I'm sorry. That's wrong and dumb. There's no division there, and there shouldn't be a division there at verse 16. If you don't know this, the headings are put in there by Bible publishers. That's not in the Bible. Social responsibility or protection of property. Those are headings that the publishers of Bibles put in there to be helpful. In this case, they're not helpful. They're actually deceptive. Yeah.
So this one has off the column side, and next to it says impurity and lasciviousness. Is that a Bible publisher deal?
Yep. That's commentary from a Bible publisher that is unwelcome as far as I'm concerned, because it's misleading. And you can. That's my opinion. You can make up your own mind. I mean, yours. So what does it say again on your Bible?
Impurity, and then
lasciviousness. So that means like overly sensual and indulgent. So look at the law that comes after the law on premarital sex says, don't allow a sorceress to live. What does that have to do with lasciviousness? And the answer is nothing, as far as I can tell. So there's not, if you were going to introduce a break here, the hermeneutically responsible place to introduce a division, if you're a Bible publisher, would be in between verse 17 and 18. And let me show you why. Look at the laws that come before in chapter 22. I'm going to read through them pretty fast, just to make the point, because I'm not really interested in the details of these laws. I want you to observe what these laws are about and the form of the laws, because they're casuistic. Chapter 22, verse 1. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. So if you steal, then you pay back fourfold. If, then. Right? If you steal this, then you do this. If a thief is caught breaking in and is struck so that he dies, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed, but if it happens after sunrise, he is guilty of bloodshed. If it's dark or light out. A thief must certainly make restitution, but if he has nothing, he must be sold to pay for his theft. Right? So if you steal, you got to pay it back. If you can't pay it back, you're sold. You're an indentured servant. It's a type of slavery. If a man grazes his livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray and they graze in another man's field, he must make restitution from the best of his own field or vineyard. So if you let your livestock roam free and they eat somebody else's stuff, then you have to make restitution for the property that you... So notice the theme so far. We're talking about property and restitution. If a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes so that it burns shocks of grain or standing grain or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. Again, if then, and restitution for lost property. If a man gives his neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if he is caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges to determine whether he has laid his hands on the other man's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which somebody says this is mine, so if there's a property dispute and someone's claiming that it's theirs and the other one says no, it's not, both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to his neighbor. Again, property and restitution. If a man gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to his neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies or is injured or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. It's really fairly obvious here what the theme is: property and restitution. The owner is to accept this, and no restitution is required, but if the animal was stolen from the neighbor, he must make restitution to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, he shall bring in the remains as evidence, and he will not be required to pay for the torn animal. So it wasn't intentional, it happened, it wasn't theft. If a man borrows an animal from his neighbor and it is injured or dies while the owner is not present, he must make restitution. So I need to plow my field, so I'm going to borrow your ox, and it gets hurt or killed. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. Now we get back to where we began. If a man seduces a virgin who is not pledged to be married and sleeps with her, he must pay the bride price, and she shall be his wife. If her father absolutely refuses to give her to him, he must still pay the bride price for virgins. This is not about social responsibility or lasciviousness or lust. This is about property and restitution. There ought to be no division if we're being faithful interpreters of the text. We don't see it this way because our culture is different, but when this was written and the people to whom it was written understood this casuistic law as an issue of property and restitution. Premarital sex is not a sexual sin in the way that we think of it. It's a property theft, because and we talked about this in the ancient world, women, and anyone will confirm this, women were either the property of their fathers or the property of their husband. And so if you sleep with a woman who is not betrothed, you have stolen property from that woman's father, and now she's no longer a virgin, and when he marries her off, he won't be able to get the bride price for a virgin, and that's why the law commands repayment. If the father doesn't want the marriage, you still have to pay, and that's what, that's the deterrent here, is that you'd be out if you sleep with this woman and the father doesn't consent to the marriage, you're out that money, and you don't even have a wife to show for it.
But when the woman wants to marry, does the father have to then reveal that she's yours?
Right. So does the father have to disclose this, like when you sell a house, someone died in this house? No, but yeah, I mean I realize that maybe this, I don't mean to sound crass, but this is the way the authors and the readers of the Bible would have understood these things, and the answer is yes. Although in this context, it's a very different world, people would know. We're talking about small agricultural communities. Things like this would be very difficult to keep secret in the first place. And people didn't, also point out, in this time, people didn't travel, people didn't move. 99% of people who lived back then lived their entire life and never moved or traveled more than 20 or 50 miles from where they were born, ever. And their children didn't either. I mean, it would be, again, 99% of people, both their fathers, their children, their grandchildren, would never even travel more than walking distance from where they lived. So something like this would be difficult to keep hidden, and it's not like you would sell the farm and move to another town and tell everybody that your daughter was a virgin. That wasn't feasible for people. People were bound to the place that they lived. My point here is that I think a faithful and honest interpretation of this doesn't allow us to put a division in between verse 16 and what comes before it. Verse 16 and 17 are clearly issues of property and restitution. And I'm not saying that's right or wrong, and I'm not saying that this is how we should or shouldn't treat it. I'm saying this is the way the Bible looks at it.
So is verse 18 related to 16 and 17?
Verse 18 seems to be come out of left field a little bit. It doesn't seem to be that's why I would put a break there. If I were publishing a Bible and wanted to introduce headings to divide it up, that's probably where I would put it. Although what comes next in 19 has to do with sexual relations. And it says anyone who has sexual relations with an animal must be put to death. And that's casuistic. If someone has sex with an animal, then you execute them. But verse 18 is apodictic. Don't allow a sorceress to live. Any questions, comments there? So yeah, my point here is that women in the ancient world, and in the perspective of the Old Testament law, women are property, and their sexuality is understood as part of property law. Whereas we would not think of it that way, and I don't suggest that we do. It's just, this is the way it was. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay. Let's move forward. Eventually, we'll get to the purity morality distinction, which you see up there towards the middle of the class. Let's turn to Numbers chapter 5. Let's take a look at that. So Numbers chapter 5, verse 11. Everyone find it okay?
Not yet.
Okay, I'll wait another. So Numbers is the fourth book of the Bible, coming right before Deuteronomy. So you don't have to go far. Don't go too far. It's Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. And this law deals with adultery and jealousy. So you found it okay? Okay, verse 11. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, if a man's wife goes astray and is unfaithful to him by sleeping with another man, and this is hidden from her husband, and her impurity is undetected, since there is no witness against her, and she has not been caught in the act, and if feelings of jealousy come over her husband, and he suspects his wife, and she is impure, or if he is jealous and suspects her even though she is not impure," so it's a little bit silly, but because how would the husband know? But it's creating this hypothetical situation. The woman may or may not have slept with another man, and somehow the husband senses or is suspicious, and he's not sure if she's been unfaithful to him. Then, verse 15, then he is to take his wife to the priest. He must also take an offering of 1/10 of an ephah of barley flour on her behalf. He must not pour oil on it or put incense on it, because it is a grain offering for jealousy, a reminder offering to draw attention to guilt. The priest shall bring her and have her stand before the Lord. Then he shall take some holy water in a clay jar and put some dust from the tabernacle floor into the water. After the priest has had the woman stand before the Lord, he shall loosen her hair and place in her hands the reminder offering, the grain offering for jealousy, while he himself holds the bitter water that brings a curse. Then the priest shall put the woman under oath and say to her, if no other man has slept with you, and you have not gone astray and become impure while married to your husband, may this bitter water that brings a curse not harm you. But if you have gone astray while married to your husband, and you have defiled yourself by sleeping with a man other than your husband, here the priest is to put the woman under this curse of the oath. May the Lord curse your people, cause your people to curse and denounce you when he causes your thigh to waste away and your abdomen to swell. Some interpreters think this might be a reference to dropsy. I'm not sure, but it's a curse wishing a disease on the woman. May this water that brings a curse enter your body so that your abdomen swells and your thigh wastes away. Then the woman is to say, Amen, so be it. The priest is to write these curses on a scroll and then wash them off into the bitter water. He shall have the woman drink the bitter water that brings a curse, and this water will enter her and cause bitter suffering. The priest is to take from her hands the grain offering for jealousy, wave it before the Lord, and bring it to the altar. The priest is then to take a handful of the grain offering as a memorial offering and burn it on the altar. After that, he is to have the woman drink the water. If she has defiled herself and been unfaithful to her husband, then when she is made to drink the water that brings a curse, it will go into her and cause bitter suffering. Her abdomen will swell and her thigh waste away, and she will become accursed among her people. If, however, the woman has not defiled herself and is free from impurity, she will be cleared of guilt and will be able to have children. This then is the law of jealousy when a woman goes astray and defiles herself while married to her husband, or when feelings of jealousy come over a man because he suspects his wife. The priest is to have her stand before the Lord and is to apply this entire law to her. The husband will be innocent of any wrongdoing, but the woman will bear the consequences of her sin. It's also, you might notice that it's a bit sexist in there's no provision for the reverse. If a woman suspects her husband, that's too bad, I think, Again, I'm not I'm not setting policy for our church or saying how I or the church views these matters. This is educational. Yeah, there's a lot of ways you can look at it. The nicest way I think you can look at this is that the biblical text acknowledges that jealousy is often a problem in marriages, and from a modern point of view, we could say, well, water that has dust and ink in it is unlikely to cause a disease in a woman. And in a way, you could say we might conjecture that this whole law is a way to keep husbands from abusing their wives and thinking that they were unfaithful. And because what's going to realistically, scientifically, what's going to happen when the woman drinks this? Probably nothing. And so the woman will be absolved and the husband can let his jealousy go. So you could, I guess what my point is, you could, if you, in the most charitable way possible, interpret this as, this is a way for the law to help husbands get over their irrational suspicions of their wives. And then the marriage can continue on in happiness. I don't have much other commentary. I just thought you ought to know this is here because this is not a text you're going to hear many sermons on, or that you'll hear read in Sunday school. Most people haven't read this text before.
So, what is expected of the man in this culture? Because a lot of what we've read today has been just like what's expected of the woman, I think.
Yeah.
So, what maybe isn't in the text that, based on studying Jewish culture, you can know is expected of a man in a relationship?
Well, in modern Judaism or ancient Judaism?
Like in this culture, it's all spoken, communicating, so why do they get to go and choose a wife? And so it's saying, women, this is what's expected of them when there's adultery, but is there communication what's expected of the man that isn't in the text?
Well, okay, if you're listening and you didn't hear, the question is, what are the expectations of the man in ancient Judaism? The first answer, I think, is that the apodictic law in the Ten Commandments doesn't single out either gender, so a man would be expected not to commit adultery. That was it was not okay for a man to sleep with another man's wife. So that is an expectation on men as well as women to not commit adultery.
But there isn't anything written about it,
Well, the adultery prohibition is written about. Don't commit adultery. That's in the Ten Commandments, and that definitely applied. It doesn't say men don't commit adultery, but it says don't commit adultery, and it doesn't. That's not limited to women. That's for everybody. So a man is expected to be faithful to his wife. That's written.
But a man was able to say, I divorced thee 3 times before the sun went down, and she'd be divorced. And she didn't have that right, I guess, did she? I don't know.
Yeah, in Jewish law, men were able to initiate divorce and women were not. Men, I mean, and the law that we just read in Exodus, a man has a responsibility to a woman he sleeps with, right? Even if she's so if the women are only in one of two conditions. They either belong again, they either belong to their fathers or they belong to their wife. So if a man sleeps with a woman who belongs to her father, then he has an obligation to marry her and pay the bride price. That's what's expected of him. If he sleeps with a woman who is married, then he has committed adultery and he is to be punished. And the consequence for that is death. And we'll get to that. I hope we'll have time. But yeah, so a man is expected to be faithful, and a man has responsibility to any woman he sleeps with. If she's not married, he has to take her as his wife.
So can you elaborate on what that means to take someone as your wife? The woman is clearly somebody's property. So what does it mean to be somebody's property? What responsibility does her father or her husband have for her?
I mean, to care for her, to give her a place to live, and also a big part of the responsibility, which we saw in Genesis, is to give her children. So a man owed to his wife protection. He owed to his wife a place in his household, and he also owes to his wife to sleep with her and give her children. Because I think we touched upon this, because if the husband dies, then she would be dependent on her children to care for her. Women also didn't have another. I didn't remember that. Women had no judicial standing. So we've talked about coming before the judges. A woman couldn't come before the judges. If she had been wronged in some way, if her property had been stolen, then she would need a man, presumably her father or her husband or her son, to represent her in court. And that would be a man's obligation as well. So, yeah, the obligations of a husband is protection, feeding, food and shelter, and to sleep with her to give her children. And also, the giving her children is very important, and it's a little bit strange to us, but you'll notice in Genesis the assumption is, and this is true in all of ancient culture, if a woman cannot have children, it's her fault. And I'm not saying that's true. I'm saying that was the cultural understanding. So if a man sleeps with his wife, he's done his part. If it's her problem. In other words, to get pregnant and have a child. And that's not right, but that's the way it was seen. And I'm not sure when that even changed. Actually, probably in some cultures that's still the case, and we know scientifically that it can be. Fertility problems are often the man's fault. Fault, I put in air quotes, and not just the woman's. But in the Old Testament and in ancient cultures, it's always seen as the woman's fault. Think of Henry VIII, right? The reason Henry VIII went through so many wives is because his wives failed to give him a male heir, and it was assumed by Henry and also by everyone that it was their fault. It was the women's fault that they didn't provide him an heir. Does that answer your question?
What happens because they're saying if a husband dies, the brother of the husband must take the wife?
And
so is everything the same there? Must he also sleep with her and have children?
Yeah, and that's why God kills Onan. Remember last week, Judah gives his first son to Tamar, and he dies, and then he gives his second son to Tamar, and he pulls out and spills his seed, and that makes God angry because that's his responsibility to Tamar is to give her children. And the reason God kills him is because he does not fulfill his responsibility as her husband.
Isn't there also somewhere, I think it's in the Old Testament, the woman is supposed to be subservient to the man, but the man is obligated to honor her and care for her feelings?
That's in the New Testament.
That's new.
Yeah. we'll get to that next week. Yeah, Paul gives directions to husbands and wives, and yeah, Paul says a woman is supposed to be obedient, but the husband is supposed to love his wife the way Christ loved the church and gave his life for it. So the husband for Paul is required to be willing to die for his wife.
That's
You know.
right, book.
Yeah, yeah, write book anyway.
Hey, for me, that's something.
Yeah,
I don't know, you talk about being a piece of property as a negative thing, but it kind of sounds like if the man's acting properly,
Mhm.
the woman's got it pretty good.
yeah. I mean yes. In fairness, yeah, I didn't mean to give it a negative connotation. The concern in the Bible is for the woman's well-being, and to make sure that the woman is cared for and protected. That's also why, and we're not going to have time to talk about it here, but that's also why there's a lot of mention of widows in the Old Testament, because widows are vulnerable and they don't have the protection of the man. And so the biblical text here, read in its best light, in reading it charitably, yeah, the concern of the law is to protect the woman. Absolutely.
Seems like kind of a contradiction to me, though, because the Jewish man his highest job was to know the scripture and study it in the yeshiva a lot of the time. And where does he work then? When and how does he work?
Well, most men were still not literate and did not read. Yeah. In this time, yeah, you're maybe having modern Judaism in mind, where Jews are literate and every Jew is expected to study Scripture. That's true of modern Judaism because modern Judaism assumes accurate that people are literate. Most people were not literate here, and they're dependent on the priests. That again, we don't have time to cover this, but that was part of the role of the priests. The priests had two roles in the Old Testament. One was to serve in the temple and to organize and orchestrate the temple sacrifices. But their second job, and what they probably spent most of their time doing, was to teach the law. And that's when we read the prophets in the Old Testament. The prophets, like Micah, for example, rail against the priests for not doing that part of their job. The priests are condemned harshly by the prophets because the priests are not teaching the law. Because in a non-literate society, the population is dependent on the priests to know the law. So a typical man would be some kind of a farmer or have shepherds, or he would work in the agricultural sphere, and he would be dependent on the priests to know the law. And part of the problem in the Old Testament is that the priests are not doing their job. Any other comments, questions there? Okay, then let's move to Deuteronomy chapter 22, and that is the next book after Numbers. I should say a little bit to introduce Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, the word means second law. Deutero means two, and nomos is Greek for law. Both of those are Greek terms. So second law. And the whole book of Deuteronomy is presented as Moses' farewell speech. The whole book is sort of a long sermon that Moses gives before he dies. And if you follow the story, we've had the Exodus. The people wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and they're going to enter the land. But Moses got in trouble when he smacked the rock, and God punished him and said, you will not enter the land. So Moses knows he's going to die. Moses is not going to live to enter the promised land. And Joshua, his successor, will take over. So there, you picture, the scene is very dramatic. The whole of Israel, or the Hebrew people, are gathered on the border of the promised land. They're about to enter and take possession of the promised land. And Moses knows this is the end for him. And so he gives a farewell speech in which he repeats the law. And that's what Deuteronomy is. So there's some overlap between the laws in Deuteronomy and Exodus, and there's some new material too. So that's Deuteronomy, second law. And we're going to look at, I want to start looking at verse 5. This is just Deuteronomy chapter 22, and we're going to start looking at verse 5. And then we're going to skip, because I'm just going to show you the pieces of the law that pertain to gender and sexuality. And in this class, I don't know what you're expecting. I don't have much of an agenda for this class. We're just looking at the texts of the scripture that discuss gender and sexuality. Again, I'm not attempting to set our church's moral positions on gender or sexuality here, or even necessarily convince you of anything in particular. I just want to expose you to the biblical teaching on the topics of gender and sexuality. So verse 5, a woman must not wear men's clothing, nor a man wear women's clothing, for the Lord your God detests anyone who does this. Now we're going to skip to verse 13. If a man takes a wife and, after lying with her, dislikes her and slanders her and gives her a bad name, saying, I married this woman, but when I approached her I did not find proof of her virginity, then the girl's father and mother shall bring proof that she was a virgin to the town elders at the gate. The girl's father will say to the elders, I gave my daughter in marriage to this man, but he dislikes her. Now he has slandered her and said, I did not find your daughter to be a virgin, but here is the proof of my daughter's virginity. Then her parents shall display the cloth before the elders of the town, and the elders shall take the man and punish him. They shall fine him 100 shekels of silver and give them to the girl's father as a kind of restitution, because this man has given an Israelite virgin a bad name. She shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her as long as he lives. And again, his that's the text is concerned with the husband's obligation to the wife, because if she were to be cast out and her husband would die, she would be a widow and be an incredibly vulnerable member of society. And the Old Testament, again, has laws that protect widows, and the prophets too. Think of Isaiah, who says, true religion is to care for orphans and widows. So the law wants to protect women, and this is part of that. So she shall continue to be his wife. He must not divorce her as long as he lives. If, however, the charge is true, and no proof of the girl's virginity can be found, she shall be brought to the door of her father's house, and there the men of her town shall stone her to death. She has done a disgraceful thing in Israel by being promiscuous while still in her father's house. You must purge the evil from among you. I'm going to pause there and make a couple points. This fills out the drama. Since we're coming on Christmas time, I want you to think about Mary, right, who is betrothed to Joseph and finds herself pregnant. And this is her situation is dire for the reason of this text, because Joseph is going to find or think that she's not a virgin, and the penalty for this for Mary would be to be stoned to death. Dying is unpleasant, but stoning is a bad way to go. And so that's part of what makes this would make the situation incredibly terrifying for Mary. I don't know if it's clear. You sort of have to read between the lines, but do you get what the proof of the virginity is? Do I need to fill that in for you? Yeah?
Me, you have to.
Okay, sorry. We've got... That's good. Innocent people in the room. My mom is here, and she... Traditionally... This is...
Just don't speak.
Traditionally, marriages You get this. You can get a sense of this in the story of the wedding at Cana. A wedding would take place in Jewish culture in the home of the woman's parents, and the the ceremony is not. We don't know what the ceremony was. There's no. We don't have a liturgy for marriage in the Old Testament. But what we do know is that the marriage would happen. They would be betrothed, sometimes months, maybe even years, because marriages were often arranged. Because again, and I don't mean this negatively, it's just descriptive. A marriage is primarily an exchange of property, but this would take place in the home of the woman's parents, and so would the honeymoon night. And the honeymoon night would take place in the father's home partly because of this. And the cloth is the bed sheet on which the marriage would be consummated. And the evidence would be blood on the sheets to show that she was a virgin. Does that? That's as graphic, I think, as we need to be.
Spread out the cloth before the oath.
Yeah. And so, and the girl's father would keep that cloth because if this ever became a problem, the father, everything is happening in the father's house. The father, that cloth, those bed sheets belong to the girl's father, and he will keep them, as insurance, right? Okay. Any other questions or comments there? Again, and it is, I mean, Megan is right. We should read this charitably and see that the concern here is to protect the woman because she's vulnerable. And you also, this does not sound progressive to us. I don't, that's the best word I can think of. But at the time, this is progressive. I mean, all of this is in the woman's favor, to protect her, to safeguard her rights, because in other ancient cultures, women did not have these kind of protections. So it was, for the most part, it was much better to be a woman in ancient Israel because of the law than it would be to be a woman in Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt or among the Philistines, for example.
Mary might have been stoned before Christ was born.
Yeah, I mean, many modern people would read this and see it as misogynistic and would see it as, anti-woman, but in its context, this is very pro-woman. And like I said, if you were going to be born a woman in an ancient culture, you would choose the Israelite culture because you'd be much more protected in Israel than you would be in other cultures. So I want to be fair and make sure that you understand this. Yeah, understand that context. All right. So that's where we're going to keep going. Verse 22, if a man is found sleeping with another man's wife, both the man who slept with her and the woman must die. You must purge the evil from Israel. So that answer is, again, I said there are obligations and consequences for men. They're just not as emphasized and sometimes in some ways not as severe. So verse 22, pretty straightforward. Any comments or questions on that? Okay, moving on, verse 23, if a man happens to meet in a town a virgin pledged to be married, and he sleeps with her. So this is different. The law in Exodus was if a man sleeps with a virgin not pledged to be married. This woman is pledged, but she's like married. She's in the intermediary phase between being a virgin and actually being married and having the marriage consummated. So the woman is promised to a man, but they have not come together as husband and wife and have not consummated the marriage yet. We don't normally have a phase like that really in our culture. So a man meets a woman who's pledged to be married and sleeps with her. You shall take both of them to the gate of that town and stone them to death. The girl because she was in a town and did not scream for help, and the man because he violated another man's wife. You must purge the evil from among you. You might have questions, but hold on to them for a second. But if out in the country a man happens to meet a girl pledged to be married and rapes her, only the man who has done this shall die. Do nothing to the girl. She has committed no sin deserving death. This case is like that of someone who attacks and murders his neighbor. For the man found the girl out in the country, and though the betrothed girl screamed, there was no one to rescue her. Well, we'll just finish. If a man, verse 28, if a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married and rapes her and they are discovered, he shall pay the girl's father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the girl, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives. A man is not to marry his father's wife. He must not dishonor his father's bed. There's an apodictic law right after a casuistic one. You can see the difference there, right? The first one is conditional. The second one is absolute. Notice before we pick this apart, notice again that the law says he can never divorce her as long as he lives. That's again a protection for the woman, and the intent behind this law is to protect women. Now, why is there moving? Now let's pick it apart. There's two laws here for two different situations. There's a law for if the sex occurs in a town, and then there's another law if the sex occurs in the country. Do you see why there's a difference?
The screams can't be heard in the country.
Right. If this happens in a city, then it's assumed that the woman is guilty because she didn't scream. She didn't cry out. If it happens in the country, there wasn't anyone there to hear it, and she could have cried out and no one would have heard. So in the first case, it's assumed to be consensual. And in the second case, it's assumed to be a rape, which again doesn't sound good to modern ears, but in context, compared to other cultures, this actually protects the woman to whom this happens in the countryside because it protects her. If this happened in the country, the woman is presumed innocent. Questions or comments there? All right. Let's jump to Leviticus chapter 15. And Leviticus will help us look at the difference between purity and morality. So Leviticus chapter 15, you're going to have to go back to the book before Numbers. 15, Leviticus 15. And I hope the innocent among us will cover their ears. But this is a text that involves bodily mechanisms and in a very matter-of-fact way. Leviticus 15. Let me know if you're having trouble finding it and I can help you. We're going to read the whole chapter here. Everyone okay? 15. Leviticus 15. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when any man has a bodily discharge, the discharge is unclean. Whether it continues flowing from his body or is blocked, it will make him unclean. This is how his discharge will bring about uncleanness. Any bed the man with a discharge lies on will be unclean, and anything he sits on will be unclean." And we're talking about semen here. We're talking about nocturnal emissions. Anyone who touches his bed must wash his clothes and bathe with water. He will be unclean till evening, so for one day. Whoever sits on anything that the man with a discharge sat on must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Whoever touches the man who has a discharge must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. If the man with the discharge spits on someone who is clean, that person must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Everything the man sits on when riding will be unclean, and whoever touches any of the things that were under him will be unclean till evening. Whoever picks up those things must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. A lot of laundry going on here. Anyone the man with a discharge touches without rinsing his hands with water must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. A clay pot that the man touches must be broken, or any wooden article is to be rinsed with water. When the man is cleansed from his discharge, he is to count off 7 days for his ceremonial cleansing. He must wash his clothes and bathe himself with fresh water, and he will be unclean. So the man himself, 7 days. Anyone who touches the items is unclean for 1. On the 8th day he must take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and come before the Lord to the entrance to the tent of meeting and give them to the priest. The priest is to sacrifice them, the one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. In this way he will make atonement before the Lord for the man because of his discharge. Notice the word atonement there. We'll come back to that later. When a man has an emission of semen, he must bathe his whole body with water. He will be unclean till evening. Any clothing or leather that is semen on it must be washed. Sorry, the discharge before could apply to any bodily fluid, including semen. This is just for semen. When a man lies with a woman, there is an emission of semen. Both must bathe with water, and they will be unclean till evening. This is why priests had to abstain from sex if they were going to serve in the temple. Verse 19, when a woman has her regular flow of blood, the impurity of her monthly period will last 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean till evening. Anything she lies on during her period will be unclean, and anything she sits on will be unclean. Whoever touches her bed must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Whoever touches anything she sits on must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. Whether it is the bed or anything she was sitting on, when anyone touches it, he will be unclean till evening. If a man lies with her and her monthly flow touches him, he will be unclean for 7 days. Any bed he lies on will be unclean. When a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while her discharge continues will be unclean, as is her bed during her monthly period, or anything she sits on will be unclean, as during her period. Whoever touches them will be unclean. He must wash his clothes and bathe with water, and he will be unclean till evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she must count off 7 days, and after that she will be ceremonially clean. On the 8th day, she must take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest sacrifice one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. In this way he will make atonement for her before the Lord for the uncleanness of her discharge. You must keep the Israelites separate from things that make them unclean, so they will not die in their uncleanness for defiling my dwelling place. So the concern here is to protect holiness, which is among them. Verse 32. I want to pause there. No, we'll just finish. These are the regulations for a man with a discharge, for anyone made unclean by an emission of semen, for a woman in her monthly period, for a man or a woman with a discharge, and for a man who lies with a woman who is ceremonially unclean. So lies being a euphemism for sex. There's a lot to say about this, but I'll tell you an amusing story first. I can't remember the author's name. There was a writer he used to write for the New Yorker, and he's since gone into writing books. And he wrote a book called A Year of Living Biblically. And he was a secular Jew. So he was Jewish, by ethnicity and birth, but he was sort of non-practicing. And he did this to write his book. He said, I'm going to try to keep every law in the Bible for 1 year. And the book is very interesting. He just writes about his experience, and it's a wonderful book. He did a TED Talk too, which if you don't want to read the book, you can listen to his TED Talk. But he tells a couple stories. One, he's on the subway and he meets this man and is in a conversation with him about what he's doing. And the man says, well, the Bible says you have to stone adulterers. And the man says, well, I'm an adulterer. I've committed adultery. Do you want to stone me? And the writer said, sure, if you'd let me, this would be... Another funny story he tells is the man was, the author of this book was married, and she was a little bit offended by some of this. And so he says what his wife did was when she was on her period, she went and sat on every seat in the house, so that there was no place he could sit without having to do laundry. So he went out and he bought himself a little stool so he could have a place to sit in his house, because his wife was a little bit resentful of this particular law.
We're talking ceremonially unclean, right? Not biologically unclean.
Okay, well, that's the issue that I want to get to. You said this is ceremonially unclean versus biologically unclean. I mean, the obvious answer, which might already occur to you, is there's no concept of biologically unclean.
So it's all ceremonially unclean.
Yes. Yes. But notice that the offerings that have to be made are sin offerings. And we would make a distinction between, and that, okay, I'll do this now. Purity versus morality. That, when we read the Bible, modern people read the Bible, we, I think, automatically recognize a difference between purity and morality, right? Don't commit adultery. Is that an issue of purity or morality? Okay. Don't touch anything a woman with her period has. Don't sit anywhere a woman with her period is sat. Is that an issue of morality or purity?
Purity.
Right. The point I need to make to you is that distinction does not exist in the Bible from the perspective of the Bible, of the biblical authors. That's why there's a sin offering. And it talks, in some translations, it actually talks about guilt. They did not make that distinction. There was no difference between a moral law and what we would call a cultic or purity law. They were that wouldn't have occurred to them. And let me again, I want to try to portray this as positively as I can. Here's why. We know from last week that the Old Testament thinks of sexuality in terms of both social structure and procreation. We covered that last week, right? That's the umbrella under which the Bible thinks about sex. Sex is about procreation and social structure. So the reason for the laws is partly what's the promise to Abraham again? To make of you a great nation, to give you children. So procreation is what's underlying and motivating a lot of these laws, and then protecting women and keeping a coherent social structure. That's why you can't have adultery, is because that would break apart the fabric of society, and that's still true. I mean, but specifically when it comes to procreation, the two fluids that we've talked about in this chapter are a woman's menstruation and a man's semen. And the way these fluids were understood is not biologically, because they didn't have biology. These fluids are important because they represent procreation and life. And so when those are, in a sense, wasted, that's a loss and a tragedy and something wrong or unclean. I mean, it's the woman's menstruation is symbolic and representative of the woman's ability to create life. The man's semen is the same, and when these are wasted, lost, the Bible recognizes this as a hindrance to the fulfillment of the command and the promise, which is to have a multitude of children. And that's why for them this is not just this is moral as well as having to do with cleanliness, and what the two are the same for them. Does that make sense? I mean, it's hard to put ourselves in this mindset, but yeah, these fluids are, and I don't think we talked about this. Is why when you sacrifice an animal, the blood is not to be consumed, right? The Bible, if any of you did Lunch and Learn when we read through Leviticus, it talked about how the blood was forbidden. You could not eat meat with blood in it because blood, semen, a woman's menstruation, these are powerful almost holy fluids. They belong to God. They don't belong to us. And so they're treated, yeah, these fluids are treated with reverence because they have the power to create life. And when they're wasted, it's bad. I want to there's a this book is called Honor, Patronage, Kinship and Purity, and it's it helped. This is a great book. I read it in seminary, and the point of the book is to help us understand the culture. And I'm just going to read a section. So this talks about purity. Purity codes, which is what we just read. Purity codes are a way of talking about what is proper for a certain place and a certain time. Pollution is a label attached to whatever is out of place with regard to the society's view of an orderly and safe world, which is why a woman who is bleeding is unclean, because blood is not where it belongs. The Old Testament purity codes are all about an order to nature. And when we talked about the creation narrative, remember how orderly it was. So blood belongs inside the body. If blood is on the outside of the body, it's unclean. If it's on the inside of the body, it's not unclean. It's fine. The easiest analogy I can make is when you walked in, you passed by some planters outside and there was dirt there. Did you think that was dirty? But if I took a cup of dirt from one of those planters and I put it on the floor in this room, would that be dirty? Because it's not where it belongs. Right? So that's just an analogy I use to kind of illustrate the concept of cleanliness and purity. It's about things being in their proper place and being in order. And blood and semen has a place where it belongs and a place where it doesn't belong. And when it's where it doesn't belong, it's unclean. So it's about an orderly and safe world. Purity has to do with drawing the lines that give definition to the world around us, distinguishing, for example, what belongs to an individual from what belongs to others, and then defending these lines from being crossed by unwelcome forces. So it's about creating boundaries. And that's important in any society. We draw different boundaries, but we nevertheless have boundaries of what belongs where. So one other section I want to read this book. So ethical holiness and pollution. That's the subheading. Many pollution taboos found in Torah, that's the law, what we just read, enforce certain codes of social behavior. We must remind ourselves, however, that the pious Jew observed no distinction between moral law and cultic law, or cultic law is another word for purity law. So for the ancient Jew, there's no distinction between moral law and purity law. The fact that both eating unclean food and committing incest brought about pollution shows the essential integration of the Torah as a single code, right? But they're listed together, and that's, to us, we would look at some of these and say, well, incest, that's moral, but having sex with your wife when she's on her period, that's cultic. But they're right next to each other, and the result is the same, which is impurity and uncleanness. So for the ancient mind, for the biblical mindset, the moral and the pure is not distinct. It's not separated. And that's hard for us to wrap our minds around. And it becomes an issue for gender and for sexuality in particular, because modern Christians, when we read the law and we read the Old Testament and we apply it to create our own morality, and again, I don't have an agenda. I'm not going to propagate a morality for you, but I will talk. When we do that, what we do is we disregard what seems to do with purity in the Old Testament, but we keep as binding or authoritative for us what seems to do with morality. And so, for example, homosexuality, which I said we would talk about, and we're almost done, one of the disagreements is whether the prohibition on sex between men is a moral issue or a purity issue. And I'm not going to tell you which it is, but that's part of the question, right? Because I don't know of any church that practices some of these prohibitions and rules for doing laundry when women are on their period, and I don't know of any church that makes wives drink dirty water when their husbands suspect them of adultery. In other words, we jettison the stuff from the Old Testament that has to do with purity, and we don't feel bad about it or wring our hands about it. But we keep the stuff that has to do with morality. But the distinction is not always clear, and the distinction is, I'll just say, debatable. And you might have the opinion that the prohibition of homosexuality is absolutely moral and should be kept, and that's fine. And you also might think that the prohibition on homosexuality has to do with cultic purity concerns and is no longer something we need to practice, and we can file it along with menstruation laws. Any questions or comments there?
What would cause a purity law to become obsolete with the passage of time?
Okay, that's a good question. What causes a purity law to become obsolete with the passage of time? The general answer is that's the church's job to decide. I mean, that's where interpretation, that's the work of interpretation, is the simple and easy answer. What laws, in the broadest possible sense, that's the question of interpretation of the whole Bible, which is we read the Bible, we recognize that this text is inspired by God, but how do we live it out?
What would be an example of that?
Well, and I don't want to jump ahead to next week, but when we do talk about the New Testament, there are verses in the New Testament specifically talks about, Paul in particular, about the Old Testament law being nullified or abolished. Ephesians uses the strongest language, and I have it written down here, but we're not going to get to it. Ephesians 2:15, Paul says the law is abolished. So another answer is to say, well, look, the New Testament with authority said that we can lay aside the law. And that's also why, for example, with homosexuality, the debate in the church, the good debates in the church don't really deal with the Old Testament law very much. And then,
Came to fulfill the law.
well, that's okay, and that's true too, because what Paul means by saying the law is abolished is not simple or clear either. Because what does Jesus say in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5? Not one jot or tittle will pass away until all has been fulfilled. Right? So Jesus seems to have affirmed the law, whereas Paul says things that say we don't live under the law anymore. So the question of the role of the law in Christian life is also a question of interpretation and application. Again, it's one thing to recognize the scriptures as authoritative and another to say, okay, what is authoritative how? Do we practice? Do we have to obey these laws? How do we obey the laws? The Sabbath is a good example. Honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. We all believe that's authoritative. But what does it mean to keep the Sabbath holy? How do you do it? Well, that requires our interpretation and choices that the church makes in the present and how to practice or apply the law. There is interpretation. My point, I suppose, is just that interpretation is required for obedience. People say, you might have heard some people say, well, I don't interpret, I just obey. That's impossible. To obey, you have to interpret. You have to figure out what it means to keep this law today. And the Sabbath is a good example.
Would dietary laws be considered purity laws?
We would consider them, most Christians consider them that way. And the New Testament gives specific instructions that especially, the New Testament talks explicitly and precisely about dietary laws. And for example, the vision that Peter has, God says, get up and eat. Like it's okay to eat things that are impure. So the New Testament gives specific attention to dietary laws and says Christians are now free to break these.
So these could be answer the question of an obsolete purity law.
Yeah.
originated when the Israelites were in the wilderness, and if they ate certain things, they'd be poisoned. Isn't that true?
In some case, I mean, in some cases, there's health concerns. A lot of the dietary laws, again, yes, some of them may have had to do with health, but in general, they have to do with this idea of orderliness. If you look at the animals that are prohibited, they are animals that that straddle two categories, right? So why are shellfish is the easiest example. Shellfish are prohibited because they live in the ocean, but they don't have scales or gill, right? So they're animals that are unclean, and it talks about this too, like animals that have hooves but don't chew the cud are unclean because the ancient Hebrew mind saw the world as orderly, and each animal is according to its kind, and animals that seem to bridge two kinds are regarded as unclean. And so, yeah, and I mean, pork can have, what does pork have in it if it's not trichinosis, but really most scholars say that the food purity laws are about animals in their kinds, and animals that are clean are animals that fit properly in a category and share all the characteristics that they're supposed to have in that category. Animals that are unclean are animals that have some qualities of one category and some qualities of another, and therefore they're unclean. We're yeah. I'm gonna take us to the half hour because there's a couple of other things I want to get done. Let's look at Leviticus chapter 20. And I think we can go, does everyone feel like they have somewhat of a grasp over the purity morality issue here and how they're intertwined in the Hebrew culture? So that, okay. Yeah, I'm going to read through this really fast. The Lord said to Moses, say to the Israelites, any Israelite or any alien living in Israel who gives any of his children to Molech must be put to death. The people of the community are to stone him. I will set my face against that man, and I will cut him off from his people, for by giving his children to Molech he has defiled, made unclean, my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. Again, notice that that's talked about in terms of pollution, but it's clearly for us a moral issue. Sacrificing your children would be for us a moral issue. For the ancient Hebrew mind, it's both. If the people of the community close their eyes when that man gives one of his children to Molech and they fail to put him to death, I will set my face against that man and his family and will cut off from their people, both him and all who follow him in prostituting themselves to Molech. I like to bring up this passage because, I mean, imagine having to tell people this. Imagine having to tell people not to sacrifice your children. And it illustrates.
What does that mean to Molech?
It means it's sacrifice. You're sacrificing your children. And Molech was a pagan god, a Canaanite deity. But it involved throwing your children into an open fire and burning them alive. Don't burn your children alive is not something that we would think would need to be told to people. And I bring this passage up to illustrate for people that morality is not natural. Morality is developed and inculcated through religion, and this is just my sort of pastorly soapbox warning against secularism, is that if you think you can have a society without religion but keep morality, that's somewhat of a dangerous proposition, because we as modern people, we have this false assumption that you should never need to tell anybody not to burn your children alive. But you did need to tell people that. And the reason we feel like it's sort of innate that no one would ever do this, and but no, it's because of the Judeo-Christian tradition that we have a moral sense that every life is valuable. That's not natural. And if you, yeah, it's my warning and my railing against secularism that a society without religion, yeah, I think most of modern culture, especially liberal culture, progressive culture, assumes that you could have a moral society without religion. And history, I think, is a warning against that. And this is a warning against that. The Canaanite people who did this were human beings just like you and I. They just didn't have a religious tradition that taught them not to burn your children, right? So you can't be too relative. Relativism doesn't work very well. You wouldn't say, well, we just have different ways of rearing children. We care for our children and they toast them. It's just different. It's not right or wrong. There's. Have I made my point here? Yeah, I'm gonna move on.
It shows how incumbent it is on the church to reach out with a morality, I think, that captures the imagination of the 21st century person.
Yeah.
And to get our story straight. And that's the hard piece when you look at the high degree of variation, even within Christianity, about what is moral.
Yeah, and it's just a warning. Don't take morality for granted as something that just is natural and people would just be decent left to themselves. They wouldn't. Probably not. It's because of our morals in our modern secular society are rooted in this tradition. And if it weren't for this tradition, and if you look at other cultures, they don't have the moral assumptions that we have, that all life is sacred. That's not the case everywhere in the world.
We have a Christian tradition, but in our schools, people are being bullied all the time to the point that they eventually have mass killing.
Yeah, mass shootings are an example of, I would say, they're a symptom that the moral underpinnings of society are eroding, and that respect for human life that some of us might take for granted as being natural isn't natural. It comes from religion. And you get rid of religion, and you're going to lose the morals. So, okay. But I want to finish Leviticus 20 at least. And I don't even know if we're going to get to 18. But I want to cover 20 first. I'm going to let's skip to 10 for the purposes of time. Verse 10 of chapter 20. If a man commits adultery with another man's wife, both the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. If a man sleeps with his father's wife, he has dishonored his father. Both the man and the woman must be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man sleeps with his daughter-in-law, both of them must be put to death. What they have done is a perversion. Their blood will be on their own heads. If a man lies with a man as one lies with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. And here, if Lorraine will hear, this is the legal prohibition against homosexuality. It's not a prohibition against homosexuality, because homosexuality, narrowly defined, as an orientation. What's prohibited is the sexual act. In other words, the Old Testament doesn't say it's sin to have a sexual orientation towards men. Sexual orientation is not a concept that occurred to them. It's the behavior that's forbidden, right? Which is why even in conservative Christian churches, ones that are right thinking. I mean, it's not a sin to be gay; it's a sin to act on it, right? And that's So, and to be fair to conservative evangelical churches, almost no conservative evangelical churches condemns homosexuals as people. If you talk to them and if you read what they've written, they're not condemning the person who is gay. They're condemning the behavior. And someone who has a same-sex desires or would say that they have that orientation, they are not condemned if they don't act on it. Does that make sense?
Can you define sexual orientation?
Can I? Well, I mean that it's a modern concept that's rooted in psychology and identity. So sexual orientation, as modern people think of it, and there's no one definition for sexual orientation. If you talk to a psychologist, you might get one definition, and versus if you talk to a biologist or a doctor, you might get another definition. And if you, yeah, but more or less, it's a facet of our identity. We think of, this is hard to do. We connect our sexual preference to our identity as modern people. I am a heterosexual. That's part of my identity. It's one factor of my identity. So it's my inner proclivity of who I'm attracted to. That's sexual orientation. So having sexual attraction to members, that's a sexual orientation. My orientation is to be attracted to and have desire for members of the opposite sex or members of the same sex. And we tend to think of that as part of our identity. But the Bible doesn't, and maybe not everybody today does. The Bible is not concerned with identities or orientations, it's concerned with behavior.
So is sexual, you're saying, in this context, when you're talking about sexual orientation, you're saying who an individual is attracted to sexually.
Yeah, as a function of their identity. That's what.
Why does that have to come into it? As a function of their identity?
Well, it doesn't have to, but it generally does in modern discussions of sexuality. And whether that's, I'm not going to defend that as right or wrong. You could say, well, I don't think sexual orientation is part of identity, and that's it. Maybe it's not, but modern psychology, for example, makes that connection.
So right now we're talking about somebody who, as part of their identity, is looping in their sexual attraction to whatever gender.
Yeah, this is part of who I am. And heterosexual people do that too. I'm a heterosexual. I identify as a heterosexual. It's tied to identity in the way a lot of people talk about it. And I can't and won't kind of argue why they should or shouldn't. It's just, yeah, does that make sense?
How does transgenderism fit into that?
That's most modern discussions of transgenderism also think of gender as a function of identity as well.
So, but does a person become transgender because they are attracted to another sex? As part of so what's their sexual orientation?
It's not connected necessarily. There are transgender people who identify as heterosexual, and there are transgender people who identify as homosexual. They're not necessarily connected.
Well, which is which? Because if you take a specific, say you're born a man and you're transgender, so you identify as a woman, and which one are you attracted to?
It depends on the person.
So then are they heterosexual if they're attracted to a man or a woman if they were born a man but identify as a woman? How do you tell the difference?
It's kind of comparing apples. It's kind of like apples and oranges when you talk about that, because there's both the internal component and the external manifestation of that internal identity, and that can vary.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit in looking at those issues like apples and oranges, and trying to make them work together. I think.
I can't answer that question. I mean, that's the debate that our society is having now. Part of the debate, anyway, is who gets to determine that aspect of their identity, and right? I mean, whether someone is a man or a woman, who gets to decide is at the heart of the modern debate.
So, if you're not sexually attracted to either male or female, what's your sexual orientation?
Well, I mean, a word that people use is asexual.
Okay, so and that's part of your sexual orientation? That could be another option, like you're either attracted to men, you're either attracted to women, you're either attracted to neither, and your identity is centered on that.
Well,
includes that.
your identity includes that, yeah.
Okay.
Well, but I
And
say
that's
that
just
I'm
how
not
we're
saying this.
talking about
I'm
that.
not speaking with authority like this is true. I'm just describing.
Right. I just wanted to know
Yeah.
what context that you keep bringing in these terms and what context they're in, and I think I now understand.
Yeah. The point I'm really going back to this text. The point I'm really making is that there is no word for homosexual in Hebrew or in Greek either. For there's no direct correlating word. We use that word to describe an orientation. The Bible has no word for a homosexual.
Does it have for heterosexual?
No. The Bible is only concerned. The Bible thinks of the Bible, the mentality or the ancient Hebrew culture does not connect identity and these sexual acts. In other words, we would say a man, look at the way it phrases. If a man lies with a man as one lies with a woman, both of them have done what is detestable. For us, if a man lies with a man, we say that person is gay or that person is a homosexual. They don't have a word for that. It's a man who committed an act that is forbidden. Does that make sense?
Yes, that's great.
Yeah. Okay. All right. If a man marries both a woman and her mother, it is wicked. Both he and they must be burned in the fire so that no wickedness will be among you. And you notice too that we don't do that for everything. If generally in common practice, and I'm just making a descriptive comment, if a man has sex with another man, we think of that person as a homosexual. But a man who sleeps with his mother-in-law is not a mother-in-law lover, or that we don't connect that action with their identity, or we don't ascribe to them a different identity based on that particular sexual behavior. But we do generally ascribe an identity as someone who commits or participates in the act of sex between two men. Does that make sense? Okay. Keep going. If a man has sexual relations with an animal, he must be put to death, and you must kill the animal. If a woman approaches an animal to have sexual relations with it, kill both the woman and the animal. They must be put to death. Their blood will be on their own heads. It's not really the animal's poor animal. Didn't do anything wrong. If a man marries his sister, the daughter of either his father or his mother, and they have sexual relations, it is a disgrace. They must be cut off before the eyes of their people. He has dishonored his sister and will be held responsible. If a man lies with a woman during her monthly period and has sexual relations with her, he has exposed the source of her flow, and she has also uncovered it. Both of them must be cut off from their people, so banishment. In some ways, for an ancient person, it would almost be worse to be cut off from your people than to be put to death. Do not have sexual relations with the sister of either your mother or your father, for that would dishonor a close relative. Both of you will be held responsible. If a man sleeps with his aunt, he has dishonored his uncle. They will be held responsible. They will die childless. If a man marries his brother's wife, it is an act of impurity. He has dishonored his brother. They will be childless. Again, an act of impurity. The moral and the pure morality and purity are wrapped up together, inseparable.
Last week that man was supposed to marry his brother's wife, his brother died.
Yes. In the case of levirate marriage, if the brother has died, then. But if he, yeah, outside of that, it's impure. It's a defilement. Okay, keep all my decrees and laws and follow them, so that I'll just stop there. But I will skip to verse 26. You are to be holy to me because I, the Lord, am holy. I have set you apart from the nations to be my own. That's the rationale for all of these laws, is for you to be holy as God is holy. And that's why all of these laws relate to this special relationship with God. And whether we would consider the law a moral issue or whether we would consider the law a cultic issue, not particularly important to the Bible, to the biblical text in the Old Testament, because all of these issues, whichever category we would file them under, relate to the unique and special relationship Israel has with Yahweh. And any of these actions, whether they're actions of impurity or immorality, jeopardize that relationship, and so they're bad. And yeah, okay. We can also look at Leviticus 18 has a list there, and I'm not going to read it, but it's a list of sexual acts that are forbidden. And again, there, it's about the Bible is interested in acts. It's interested in verbs. It's interested in actions that are either permitted or not permitted, forbidden or not forbidden. All right. That takes us through all the texts I wanted to get through today that are part of the Old Testament law. Next week, we're going to move into the New Testament and look at what Jesus and Paul mostly say about sexuality. Are there any questions about anything we've covered? Is there anything in the New Testament that you really want me to cover? If you're interested in homosexuality, the two texts in the New Testament that address homosexuality are Romans chapter 1, and I can't remember the verse, and 1 Corinthians chapter 6. 6:9 is the verse there. Okay, let's end with a word of prayer. God, thank you for your word. May it guide us, instruct us, and may we apply it to our lives in ways that honor you, and may we understand it and interpret it in ways that allow us to be holy as you are holy, that our sexuality and our gender are all part of who we are and part of how we honor you in the way that we live. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.